I'm Mike Dowdy, and this is the School Leadership Show. In this episode, I interviewed Dr. Rebecca Stoball, an experienced teacher and principal who's now an author, consultant, and college professor. Early in her career as a middle school principal, Becky saw the need to improve the critical thinking skills of her students. She and I talk about what she learned during that process, including the 5 misconceptions about critical thinking. While we focus primarily on supporting teachers as they help students develop critical thinking skills, this conversation transcends the specific content and hits many important leadership concepts, like the importance of mentors, achieving critical mass for change, and focusing initiatives. This was a great conversation, and you can learn more about Becky and her work at mentoringminds.com. Enjoy this interview with Dr. Becky Stoball. So I'm here with Dr. Becky Stoball. Becky, thanks for joining me today.
Sure, glad to be here.
And I contacted you initially after seeing an article that you wrote about critical thinking. And it's such an important uh, aspect of education in general and instruction in particular that I thought we'd start our conversation there. So before we get into that, could you tell folks a little bit about yourself and your background and what you're currently working on?
Absolutely. I'm a previous middle school and high school teacher and left teaching to become a middle school principal. I served as a middle school principal for several years and then moved to the university level. And now I work with teacher candidates and also people that are currently teaching and they're working on their master's program.
Excellent. So you wrote about some misconceptions related
Yeah.
to the teaching of critical thinking. Can you kind of talk us through those?
Of course. A lot of these misconceptions emerged as I moved from the classroom to the principalship. I noticed as I was working with my teachers, there were a lot of different um, misconceptions about what we thought. I thought when we said critical thinking, we all meant the same thing, but some people thought very differently. And one thing that I noticed was that in lesson plans, they would sometimes note that the critical thinking questions or the high level questions would be just for the gifted learners. So all students did not get access to those higher level questions. And the problem with that was on our state assessment, most of the questions were high level. And so we essentially were making sure our high ability kids could be successful, but not our other students. So we had to rethink, are we providing a curriculum that really provides access to all kids engaging in critical thinking? One particular example would be in my math department. We had very low scores when I arrived at the school, and I just did walkthroughs in all the classrooms to see what was going on, what could potentially be the issue. And I noticed a lot of the problems that they were using that the students were doing homework and practicing on were things that were more computational, like 2x equals 8, for example. Whereas on our state assessment, the questions were situated in a real world context with information, and some of the numbers in the problem were irrelevant to the task. So the students really had to screen through and understand the task and then figure out what applied to the task. And those were not the type of questions that we were doing in our classrooms. So we had to really rethink what we were doing. We had to, of course, teach the basics computation, but we couldn't leave it there. We definitely had to ratchet it up and make sure all kids had access of learning to deal with these problems, that problem solving skills.
So how
So
did you
that
do that? Was it enough to just point out to folks to say, "Hey, did you notice that you're only asking your highest performing kids the critical thinking questions?" Or like what did you do to move people along that continuum?
Well, first, one of the things I think all school leaders need to first do is understand we all have to talk the same language about what critical thinking is. And in in our state, a lot of us use Bloom's taxonomy. And so, really digging into Bloom's taxonomy and what are those levels, I find that people have very superficial understanding of Bloom's taxonomy. They use those words, for example, the highest level of the revised taxonomy that was revised in 2001 is create. But create, people use that word, so, and that's another one of the misconceptions, is they use that word and thinking that that's very high level. But creating a PowerPoint about facts about George Washington is very low. It's not a high level. So we had to kind of go back to the basics and make sure we all understood the foundation of what those levels are cognitively, what are the expectations at each one of those levels. And we discussed examples, and we had to create that foundation and that common vocabulary and common understanding of the different levels. And from there, then you could push forward to say, okay, now let's look at our assessments. And so one thing I had them do is on the assessments, the common assessments that they would use at the end of the unit, they coded them based on the standard, and they also coded them back to thinking levels. So I wanted to see that our thinking levels were inclusive of the higher levels on Bloom's taxonomy.
And I think, when you think back to how when Bloom designed that taxonomy initially, it wasn't necessarily that higher was always better. It was just used as more of as a taxonomy or a description. So, did
Right.
you get into that with teachers at all?
Well, there some standards don't expect for you to go to the create level. The the create level is impossible on a lot of tasks. You really just wouldn't want to do that. So, but a lot of the standards at least go at least at a middle and high. If you talk about the secondary, there a lot of them are on the apply, analyze, or evaluate. So you had to take a look at what are the cognitive expectations of those standards, and so where are we ensuring we have instruction that truly aligns to the idea of the standard and the cognitive demand that's required of that standard? So that's some of the things that we really took a look at. We looked at those test questions very closely, and a lot of people thought that they had high level questions because sometimes they thought that if it was hard, it was high level. You know what I'm saying?
Uh huh.
If it's an obscure fact, it might be hard, of course, but that doesn't equate necessarily with critical thinking. Those are two different things. So we talked a lot about one good guide, and I still give this to teachers: is how long can students produce an answer for you? If they can produce an answer for you fairly quickly, you're probably at a low level. The longer it takes for them and their mind to develop the answer, probably you're moving on to some of those higher level thinking
Well, and I think that
strategies.
that's an important distinction because there's a difference between recalling an answer and
Yes,
developing an answer.
yes, yes,
And probably getting folks to think in those terms is important. Now, you talked a little bit about assessment before, and you
yes.
mentioned, looking at those assessment questions. And I think one of the things that we often, try to get across to teachers is you can't teach one way and assess another and expect
Right.
the students to do it. So you mentioned one of your misconceptions deals with oral questioning, right?
Yes, yes. Well, one of the schools that I have worked with, collaborated with, I was doing a training on that day with the teachers about critical thinking, and the next day they were going to have instructional walkthroughs. Well, the administrators had told the teachers the only thing that they were going to code for those instructional walkthroughs would be what the teacher was saying. And so I had a lot of concern. And I spoke to the administrator because, sometimes those questions, the good questions, will not be just orally given out by the teachers, but they will be written down because in order, those really, the tasks that are really at an analyze and evaluate level, students really need to parse it out. They need to break it apart. They need to think about it. It's not going to be a quick answer back to the teachers. It's going to be a delay. And to do that, either the teacher's going to have to say the question over and over and over, or they're going to put it on a piece of paper or on the screen for students to think about, and have time to really develop their answer. So we actually talked to the administration. So the next day they decided to code not only what the teacher said, but what the students did, the comments from the students and their actions, which was a better way to capture the level of critical thinking in the classroom instead of simply what a teacher says.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's amazing to try to get folks beyond just what the teacher is doing and to actually look at what the students are doing and producing.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So your the other misconceptions about critical thinking. So we hit only for high achieving students, more than oral questioning. Um, what were the other ones?
Well, one that I found, this was particularly one that I found when I was in as a principal, was that critical thinking assessments can be used multiple times. We had worked as a faculty, all the departments had worked together to create common assessments. And I had looked at them. They were really in a good shape. And my social studies department, particularly, I was really excited. These were great questions. Well, the day before the test, did some, 5 to 10 minute walkthroughs throughout the building. And when I went through and did the walkthroughs, I noticed that one of our social studies faculty had the test in her hand and was going over the questions. Well, those questions, when she was using during the review session, were higher level because the students had never seen them before. They were asking them to connect their prior knowledge to a new political cartoon and a new quote and things like that. But then the next day, because she had gone over the answers and they had all talked about them, the next day, then when it was an assessment, it was back to recall again because they'd already discussed those. In order for her to really have a high level assessment, she needed to have a set of questions for the review that were similar, but not the same. Because the same questions, if I've once I tell them that once we discuss the answer, it's just a fact now. So that was a misconception that we really needed to develop a bank of questions that were high level, that we could use for both review sessions and another set that would be on the summative assessment.
Now,
Because, go ahead.
go. I was going to say is that is not necessarily something that comes naturally to teachers developing those high level
No,
questions,
it's
right?
not. It is not. And that actually precipitated when I moved to the university level. I actually wrote two books assessing critical thinking and in middle and high school and another set for elementary. And both of those work on laying the foundation of Bloom's taxonomy and what teachers instructionally can do at each one of those levels, as well as highlight ways to boost those assessments. And some things that I talk about and show multiple examples in all the content areas are using graphics, scenarios, using quotes, presenting them a new stimulus to connect to what they already know. So taking prior knowledge and then connecting it in a new way, can boost that cognitive level of the assessments. But yes, you're right. Good items take a while. So departments would work collaboratively to develop these common assessments. And we didn't do it all at once. They would work on, 1 quarter, they'd work on one of the assessments. And the next quarter, the next one, the next year, we would add the second one in. So you can't do it all at once. But they were all working together on the same assessment. So multiple people were providing items. But you're right, it does take a while to develop good assessment items.
And did you find as because nobody likes change, right? So as the teachers got into it, did they see the value and did it become a skill once practiced and learned that became easier for them over time?
It did become easier. I will not kid you that people thought it was rough. When I said, okay, when we turned in our assessments, we as a content area that I had content area leaders, we agreed on the percentage of items that would be simply recall, and that no more than that would be that. Then everybody, all the other questions had to be at these certain levels. So we wanted to make sure that we were reaching to those higher ends. There was a lot of pushback on the front end. I won't sugarcoat that. That was the way it started. Over time, yes, it became easier, but we all know about that implementation. Um, you know, low. There's going to be some challenges along the way, and there definitely were. But I felt like in order for us as a school to move forward, we had to push through this to get aligned. So I will say, after it took us a year to kind of lay the foundation, the second year we got better, and by the third year we were in a much better shape where the assessments were. Um, at a higher level of critical thinking than what we had previously.
So, all right. Then you had a couple more misconceptions, and then I
Sure.
wanted you to talk a little bit through how why critical thinking and your thought process in terms of implementation for that kind of initiative. But let's finish the
Okay.
misconceptions first.
Sure, sure. Well, we've already discussed a little bit about the high level words. That is commonly seen, and I still see that when I work with teachers. So throwing the word create, or they get on those Bloom's taxonomy verb sheets and they
Yep.
plunk one out. And because it sounds synthesize, if I put synthesize this passage and describe what this word is. Well, that's not. That is an understand level. It's understanding the text. Just because I pull a high level verb doesn't necessarily mean that I'm doing that. And I mentioned the word create. That one is always very misconstrued. The idea of creating a PowerPoint about President Washington. Well, it could be high level. An example of that would be if I created a PowerPoint about George Washington and had him run against President Obama today, and I was the political strategist, how would I transform? What would I need to do to get him ready to run against the next election or in this current election? So that is high level. But if I just summarize President Washington's, presidency, that could be very low level. In fact, they could just copy and paste facts from the internet, which is what I see happening a lot. So that's create the use of create can be very different. So it needs to be teachers need to and administrators need to think about how long are students really thinking and processing and developing their answer to come at to arrive at the answer. And one good way to do that, and I mentioned this in my books and trainings, the real world. Anytime you can connect the real world and have them connect that to their prior knowledge is a way to boost the level of thinking in an assessment item or a task. Um, so that's another misconception. The final one I think we mentioned in the article is that all teachers know how to facilitate critical thinking. We think that a lot of teachers, when they graduate college and their undergrad program and they get their teaching certificate, they're ready to go on critical thinking. Well, we know that all teachers have strengths, and they also have areas that they need to work on, and so many of them still are not fully aware of how to develop items, how to develop instructional tasks that are high level. They need some support. They need guidance. They need somebody to take a look at what they're doing and give them some feedback so that they can move forward and do that. As a principal, I found that a veteran teacher of 30 years might be exceptionally great at critical thinking or maybe not at all. And then I might have a new teacher that would come in that may be exceptionally great or not. It didn't matter the years of teaching, unfortunately. I found that people were just all over the board in my building. And so we really had to take the time to go back and develop a common language across the whole faculty before we can move forward and make sure we're all aware of what we're doing.
And I think that common language piece is so important because when you get these terms, particularly in education, when that everybody thinks they understand, if you ask 10 teachers if they differentiate instruction, oh
Yeah.
yeah, of course I do. But then you
Yeah,
ask, you go a little deeper and ask for, examples of it and poke a little bit, you start to see, well, maybe not so much. So
absolutely.
so as a school leader, I mean, you really you have to make choices about what you're going to go after and what you aren't.
Hmm.
And how did you end up with critical thinking as kind of an initiative to pursue with your faculty?
Hmm. Well, we had, as I'm sure most schools are, we had uneven results. I had some of my content areas that were doing exceptionally well in our state assessment, and some weren't. And doing walkthroughs, I think that made me a little bit aware of what was going on. But then when we started looking at the assessments, when we took a look, I found many of my teachers were actually doing a great job of critical thinking in the formative process as far as instructional strategies. But then when we captured whether they had actually mastered the skill on the summative was very low level. So we really didn't have accurate data to really measure their thinking and their ability to master the standard. It seemed like the assessment items, because they struggled with developing good ones, they tended to kind of revert to more lower level assessment items. So that became aware, and that became something that I noticed in the faculty. And so, in order, I realized we really had to start with alignment. We really had to get ourselves aligned to the standards in the content and the blooms. And if we're going to start there, start with that assessment piece. And once I felt like we got our assessments aligned, it would also then drive back and help us. With our instructional piece. So I guess that's just one of the initiatives that became a passion piece of mine. And I felt like I was in a community that was rural and also had some high SES, and a lot of our students didn't go to college. So I preached a lot, I guess, preached that we were their ticket in. We really had an opportunity to give them the skills to be successful on the ACT and on these other tests if we could teach them how to think. And that was more than just spreading content. We needed to give them the skills to critically think, both for to be successful in college, but also in career and their life. So we needed to make an investment here, a long-term investment in our students' lives. And I guess that just became a passion for me. And then I just felt like we could really do help our students a lot through that initiative.
And it sounds like you were pretty thoughtful in your approach to it. You identified a learning problem or an issue. You made a conscious choice to start with assessment, and then that drove instruction. If you think back on it, on the process, because this didn't all happen in 6 months, right?
And no, it did not. No, it did.
Exactly. And
Well,
is there anything that, I mean, anything you would have done differently? Or if you think, gee, when I look back at that, I kind of wish I had done this instead of that.
Well, I will say that when I started this process, I was a new principal. That was a first year principal for me, my first year in the principalship, and so I knew that I didn't know everything. And so I found a principal that I thought was very forward thinking and ahead of the time. And once a year, I would meet with her and just talk to her about some of the things that they were doing. So I would pick her brain a little bit, and that really helped me, I guess, formulate and kind of get a direction. So I feel indebted to that. That helped me a lot. And of course, going to trainings and other things like that and learning from others was a critical piece, to helping us kind of move forward. I will say, if of course, oh my, there's so many things I look back now that I could have done so much better. I think it's important that while I'm gung ho, it's easy as leaders, I think, for us to be really excited and to be passionate about moving, but understanding that not everybody in your building is on that same level, and trying to rally the troops and get everybody together and make sure we're really focused and not trying to take on too many things at one time, but really have um, a focused initiative that carries through several years, till it's really we've mastered that. Um, at the beginning when I started, I think I tried to take on too many things and had to come back and say, "Whoa, I've really taken on too many ideas. I really need to focus on a few things." So, yes, there are many things that could be improved. I think that singular focus of wrapping a professional development initiative through a year, even on to a second year, until staff really have achieved the goal and understand the goal. So I could have done definitely a better job of that.
I think we all fall into that trap as new administrators because you all of a sudden have this new perspective and you see everything and think, "Oh man, I have to work on all this stuff all at once."
Yes, yes.
Now, we're bumping up against some time here, and I want to be
Sure.
sensitive to you and your
Okay.
time, and because I do appreciate you taking the time to talk with me.
Sure.
Um, Kind of want to you mentioned that you kind of made that transition from teacher to school administrator. Now you're in higher ed and teacher prep. And,
Yes.
I know in upstate New York, for the last 10 years, we've been telling people not to go into education because there aren't any jobs. And lo and behold, they listened. And now we don't have any teachers. so, or sometimes I think you'll hear, at least I hear my colleagues lamenting about how, the folks coming out of particularly undergraduate teacher preparation programs aren't maybe what we hoped they would be right out of the box. So when you think about the teacher prep program that you're involved in or other ones that you know about,
Mhm.
what are some of the good practices out there that you're seeing in terms of teacher preparation that are making a difference for these folks coming out?
Well, I am an associate professor at Western Kentucky University, and I'm really proud of some of the initiatives that we have worked on. We For the last about 2 or 3 years, we've been working on our high school and middle school program, and I'm program leader for that program at our university. And we have tried to move to more a clinical based program. And so I teach, I'm not doing it this year, but the last 2 years, I've actually been embedded in the high school and I teach there. I have a classroom there and I teach them strategies, for example, on questioning. And then they have time to prepare. And then the next class, I will go see them in the actual classroom practicing those strategies. And I will coach and provide feedback. So, one of the things that I think that is working is when students are taking that and immediately applying it and getting feedback. I really think that practice is helping to really improve ours. We always had prior to this kids that are teacher candidates that were excellent on paper. They could develop wonderful lesson plans, beautiful lesson plans, but then the delivery was a huge problem. But they might, not be able to handle the management. They might have hangups on different areas. Well, now we're doing that early on. When they first jump into the teaching courses, they're out, they're getting feedback on what they need to improve. They're seeing exactly what a classroom looks like and what the expectations. Some decide that it's not for them. It really isn't their passion. It isn't what they really want to do. And that's okay. Others many of them, most of them will continue on the journey. And through a lot of coaching and feedback, they can really be equipped with the skill. So, what we don't want to do is let student teaching be that real world experience, and that's it. We want to back those opportunities up much earlier in the program to have students be engaged in those classrooms. They're getting feedback and they are improving classroom management and these skills early on so that it's by the time they get to student teaching, they're much more equipped with a holistic set of skills that help them be a good teacher.
Man, I couldn't agree more. And I think one of those skills that you're you're developing in there is the ability to accept and use feedback in your practice. Because I think sometimes that's what we bump up against with teachers who
Absolutely.
they're not used to receiving critical growth producing feedback in a timely manner and then
Absolutely.
flipping it around and using it in their practice. Oh,
Absolutely.
that sounds fantastic.
Well,
um yeah, go
I
ahead.
was just going to say, we talk a lot about I teach the first course of this. It's a blocked course of about 6 to 9 hours. And so I have them all day, Tuesday, Thursday. And we talk at the very front of the program about professionalism. What does professionalism mean? And I share with them, if you have a strong work ethic and you're willing to listen to feedback, you'll be successful. You will be successful because you can evolve and grow. And we talk about it's not a destination, it's a growth. We're looking for growth in you. We're looking that you add on skills. It's not about all of a sudden being an exceptional teacher. Every teacher is growing and should be throughout their career. And that's what we want to see in them. We want to see that ability to grow and evolve and change. So Yes, I think that's a key skill set, and we talk about that a lot in our professionalism component at the very beginning before we start the semester.
So you're busy. I mean, you're working in schools, writing books. You know, any do you have any particular habits or routines, or I don't like the term life hack, but whatever that productivity wise that either you learned as a teacher or an administrator or in your current role that you think might help aspiring and practicing school leaders to be more productive in their own right.
Oh my, that's wide open there. Well, I guess I'm always I don't know. There's, I guess, a couple of things. One thing, I'm trying to be always open to new opportunities. This particular article was published with Mentoring Minds, a lady, Sandra Love. We connected. She read my book and connected with me, and as a result of that partnership, we've worked on a lot of professional development and different things together. And so I'm just always seeking new things that will encourage me to grow. I will be going in about a month to China and training some teachers in China. So I try to look for things that will stretch myself. Next week, I'm going to be doing a webinar training because I know that's an area I want to expand my abilities. So I guess I'm looking for things on the horizon that will stretch me, that will challenge me. And I do have a busy life. I have two children in the family, so I try to manage that well, but I try to get ahead of things. My colleagues always say, Becky's always got it done. I mean, I try to move and on projects and try to keep, a task list of things that I need to accomplish. And I try to get ahead on certain things, knowing that I have a lot of deadlines. But if I get ahead on a couple things, then even if I slow down, I'm still ahead on those. So just keeping a task list. I use my calendar a lot to track things very practically. If you travel a lot, I love TripIt. I keep all my travels in there, and that's an organizational tool for me for traveling. Um, so I don't know if that's what you wanted, but
That's perfect.
mixture.
Absolutely. So, Dr. Becky Stoball, thank you so much for taking time to talk to aspiring and practicing school leaders. And where can people go to learn more about you and your work?
Sure. Well, I'm on Twitter, Rebecca Stovall on Twitter. I have assessing critical thinking in middle and high school and assessing critical thinking in elementary schools. And then I produced a book with through Solution Tree this year with digital tools. It's called Real World Learning. So it's a framework that couches critical thinking with digital tools and real world applications. So that book. And then I love partnering with Mentoring Minds. They're passionate about critical thinking. And so I've done a webinar through EdWeek. So there are different webinars if they're interested to access and see some of their trainings that I've done. And feel free to email me. I'm always interested in having those conversations, right? It's all about helping our teachers so that in the end product, we're helping our students be more successful college, career, and life through the lens of, I feel like critical thinking can help quite significantly.
Fantastic. I'll make sure I put your Twitter handle in the show
Perfect.
notes. And
Thank you.
thank you so much for taking time to talk with me today. What a great conversation.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the School Leadership Show, a podcast for aspiring and practicing school leaders. Send your comments, questions, and show ideas to mike@schoolleadershipshow.com. And please consider rating the podcast in iTunes and leaving a comment and pass the show along to your colleagues.